Well, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, David. All right, so welcome everyone. We are thrilled to have you with us today. Excelsior University leadership, the Center for Social Justice, the Race and Ethnicity Rope team, and the Underground Railroad Education Center welcome you to Excelsior's celebration of this year's Black History Month, Agents of Change, Voices of Freedom. We have very special guests with us today, Mary Liz and Paul Stewart, founders of the Underground Railroad Education Center, amazing leaders and role models in our community, and wonderful partners in our ongoing justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion work. Thank you, Paul and Mary Liz, for being here. We are honored to have you. But before we introduce you formally, I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. David Scable, President of Excelsior University, who has kindly offered to say a few words about this year's Black History Month. David? You're muted, David.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
So thank you, Daniel, and welcome. Black History Month is a celebration of the rich legacy, achievements, and contributions of Black individuals and communities throughout history. Since its inception in 1926 by Carter G. Woodson as Negro History Week, Black History Month has grown into a nationwide commemoration honoring the struggles and triumphs of Black people from slavery to freedom, from segregation to equality. This year's Black History Month theme is African Americans and the arts. Whether digital, literary, visual, or performing arts, Black trailblazers and innovators have revolutionized their fields, often transforming them by pioneering new techniques and styles. Through art, important issues and figures in African American history are exalted, and underrepresented stories are shared and preserved. For the entire month of February, we invite everybody to join us in celebrating art and its relationship with justice. Art plays a role in communicating emotions, building community, and inspiring action. We encourage all Excelsior University students, faculty, staff, and alumni to join us as we explore the stories, achievements, and impact of Black people across the diaspora. Together, let us continue to lift and celebrate the beauty and brilliance of Black culture. Thank you. Back to you, Dan.
Thank you, David. And now I have the honor of introducing our Black History Month keynote speakers, Mary Liz and Paul Stewart. They are independent researchers and co-founders of the Underground Railroad Education Center, which is a public history organization that highlights the voices of Black abolitionists and freedom seekers, and which is dedicated to researching, celebrating, and preserving the local and national history of the Underground Railroad movement, its international connections, and its legacy to today's social justice issues, thereby empowering people of all ages to be agents of change toward an equitable and just society. Mary Liz and Paul's seminal research into local Underground Railroad history has contributed to a paradigm shift in the understanding of the impact of this historic movement in the history of New York State and the nation. Throughout the past 20 years, they have organized an annual public conference on the Underground Railroad, have led scores of walking tours in Albany and Troy, have spoken to hundreds of groups, published numerous articles, simulated the creation of DVD educational materials, and created curriculum materials. Mary Liz and Paul have raised and managed over $1 million for the preservation work of the Stephen and Harriet Myers residence. If you haven't had the chance, go and visit it. It's just an amazing place to be in and to learn about. It is an award-winning Underground Railroad site that is on the National Register of Historic Places, on the National Park Service Network to Freedom, one of 26 sites on the New York State Underground Railroad Heritage Trail, and an invited member of the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience. Their discovery of the Stephen and Harriet Myers residence site is important, as it is the only African-American themed public historic site in New York State with a story centering on an African-American abolitionist who, as an Underground Railroad activist, had been previously enslaved in New York State. Mary Liz and Paul, thank you so much for being here today. We're really honored to have you. The floor is yours.
Thank you.
Let me share my screen.
Mhm.
Yeah.
We'll go on to the next one.
We're ready to go.
Number 2. Inspired by Madiba Nelson Mandela's quote, "What counts in this life is not the mere fact that we have lived it. It is what difference we have made to the lives of others." We stand here, we join you today as agents of change who share with others the voices of freedom of those who have been written out of the American narrative. Mhm.
Let us introduce ourselves. I am Paul Stewart. This is Mary Liz Stewart. We are co-founders of the Underground Railroad Education Center based at the award-winning Stephen and Harriet Myers Residence Historic Site in Albany, New York. The center is a nonprofit that explores the story of the Underground Railroad from the perspective of Black abolitionists and relates that story to contemporary justice issues.
We are living in a fast-paced, conflicted times of turmoil and discontent. We have been handed legacies of injustice and of inspiration and equity by our communal ancestors. How do we respond? In order to put some stability in our lives, do we hunker down and focus our energies just on our own world? Do we let frustration and anger move us? Do we push back with strategies intended to right what is seen as wrong?
How did we, Mary Liz and I, become agents of change? We did not long to be agents of change. We just wanted to find answers to our questions. 26 years ago, when Mary Liz was a 5th grade teacher and Paul was a community social service worker, we embarked on a personal research project. Mary Liz was teaching her students about the Underground Railroad and felt her lessons would be much better, much more effective if she could bring into her classroom stories of real people from the community who were involved in the Underground Railroad. She had been reading, teaching about it and assigning a fiction chapter book as a way of getting at the subject. She desired a way to help her 10-year-old tangible thinkers to better understand this piece of American history. I was charged with finding documented information about local Black activists of Albany to write about for the South End Scene newspaper.
So we put our needs together and our research project began. We approached others we believed to be more knowledgeable than ourselves with the hope that they might help us in our quest for information. Many of them told us that nothing of any importance happened in our community. They told us we could look in some neighboring communities where we might find old buildings. At first, we accepted what they said, but eventually, being unwilling to accept this response, we decided to learn about the Underground Railroad generally through the reading of scholarly sources. In these sources, we found bits and pieces scattered throughout that made reference to our community. Pieces of a puzzle began to take shape.
Next slide.
No, go ahead.
It's here that we always like to give a shout out to our local librarians. Their help was immeasurable. This was in the era before personal computers were as widespread as they are now. We took our questions to the librarians who used interlibrary loan to round up sources that were not locally available. We had many dates with the microfilm and photocopier machines.
Next slide. It was like opening a treasure chest. In these period documents with which we were engaging, we met many new people with a different accounting of this Underground Railroad business. We were excited and inspired. The dichotomy of white abolitionists generously helping those poor oppressed slaves out of their misery was being challenged as we read about freedom seekers exerting self-agency to self-emancipate from the bondage of enslavement, as we read about Black abolitionists in leadership positions engaging across state, national, and international boundaries, working to abolish the institution of slavery. It was at this point that we decided that this work, this story, could not stop with us and our respective audiences. By rights, it belonged to the community.
Little by little, as we pieced together the story of the Underground Railroad as it had existed in our community, it wasn't true that nothing of significance happened here. In fact, our community had been the hub of activity, and some events of significance had taken place there. What were some of these things? The trial of the Jerry rescue defendants took place in Albany. The rescue was a major event in neighboring Syracuse, but the trial was held in Albany City Hall. The city was a major area of traffic for the Underground Railroad, with thousands reaching Albany across each decade of the Underground Railroad period in the 1840s and 1850s. Next slide. Key figures such as Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, John Brown, Gerrit Smith, and others visited Albany. And then there were many local activists as well. After a while, we had composed a pretty good picture of the Underground Railroad, identified abolitionists, freedom seekers, locations, and much more. As we learned this past, it began to shape our present.
So the question became, how do we share these inspiring stories of justice activists who dedicated their lives to working for justice and equity, but who had no place in the American narrative? We, who had graduate degrees in pastoral studies and education. Well, we took Shirley Chisholm's recommendation to heart. If they don't give you a seat at the table, bring in a folding chair. And we forged ahead, despite the fact that we lacked the academic credentialing that would validate our research and what we had to say. What we did do was promise ourselves that we would honor the integrity of the historic documents.
We moved from curious inquiries to creating a walking tour, a conference, and discovering an historic site. We quickly began working on the historic site restoration. Did we know about building restoration? Absolutely not a thing. But this house had a story, an important story that had to be told. And this house, as a tangible artifact, allowed us to interact with this inspiring story in a teachable, touchable way. Shirley Chisholm's voice spoke to us again. In the process, we learned many more stories that were transformative in their hearing and telling. We became agents of change as we discovered and shared those voices of freedom. These voices were also agents of change for us. Let me introduce you to some of these stories. Back up one slide. There you go. Stephen and Harriet Myers were a dynamic 19th century Black couple who worked for justice in so many ways. They were involved with starting newspapers, suing the city school district of Albany, organizing a farming community, and tirelessly providing food, clothing, and shelter to hundreds of people journeying on the Underground Railroad. Their tenacity and persistence made them central figures in the 19th century freedom struggle.
In Stephen Myers' obituary from 1870, it is written, Stephen Myers was a prominent man among his race, being an agent for the Underground Railroad before the war, and did more for his people than any other colored man alive, not excepting Frederick Douglass. And from Harriet Myers' obituary, written in 1865, it is written, Mrs. M was an active and energetic anti-slavery woman and believed in reducing the theories of slavery to the slavery question to practice. And she did. She contributed largely to the support of the cause in its darkest days. She manifested a deep interest in the great struggle for universal liberty and equal suffrage.
Harriet Jacobs became one of the first Black women to author a memoir about her experiences as an enslaved woman seeking her freedom. Her book, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, sold well at the time. The memoir told of her experiences and the challenges she faced and how she made her way to New York to find her freedom, for herself and her family.
Harriet Jacob writes, Reader, it is not to awaken sympathy for myself that I am telling you truthfully what I suffered in slavery. I do it to kindle a flame of compassion in your hearts for my sisters who are still in bondage, suffering as I once suffered.
Born in Africa about 1753 and sold as a slave in Boston in 1761, Phyllis Wheatley was a small, sick child who caught the attention of John and Susanna Wheatley. Purchased as a domestic servant for Susanna, the small girl was named after the ship that brought her to Boston, the Phyllis, and her master, Wheatley. Phyllis Wheatley gained notoriety as a poet in her short lifetime and is considered the first African-American author of a published book of poetry.
Should you, my lord, while you peruse my song, wonder from whence my love of freedom sprung, whence flow these wishes for the common good, by feeling hearts alone best understood. I, young in life, by seeming cruel fate, was snatched from Afric's fancied happy seat. What pangs excruciating must molest, what sorrows labor in my parents' breast. Steeled was that soul, and by no misery moved, that from a father seized his babe beloved. Such my case. And can I then but pray others may never feel tyrannic sway?
Edmonia Lewis is considered the first professional Black and Native American person of color sculptor in the United States and the first to achieve international acclaim. Opposition to her and her work led her to leave the United States and take up refuge and residence in Italy. Even though much of her work has not survived into the 21st century, Lewis used her art to depict stories of women and indigenous people with reverence and beauty.
Edmonia Lewis reminds us, sometimes the times were dark and the outlook was lonesome, but where there is a will, there is a way. While there are many others who could be named as agents of change, I ask you, will you take the time to explore the past, your family's past, your communal past? Will you let the past influence your present and help you stretch into the future to be an agent of change and a voice of freedom? I would like to share one more story with you, a contemporary story, a small story with a big impact. Leon and Ray, neighbors of the Stephen and Harriet Myers residence, don't get recognized in the news, but they stay the course. They have remained in a community that has been and continues to be challenged by redlining, urban renewal, and disinvestment, and yet they stay the course. They are anchors in the community. They are the keepers of the history of the community. As others have fled the neighborhood, Ray and Leon are agents of change who have remained steadfast in their commitment to see the neighborhood through tough times into better days.
Stories can be shared through many and varied forms. Stories capture what has happened, what is happening, what is hoped to happen in the future. Stories connect people across time and space. Each of us is a living story. How do we capture that story, live that story, share that story, so as to empower others, ourselves and others, to be agents of change toward an equitable and just society?
May we all find our way to be agents of change and voices of freedom as we learn the past, work in the present, and create together a better tomorrow.
In closing this portion of our keynote, we would like to say thank you to Daniel Pasco Aguilar and President Scable for inviting us to speak with you today. We hope that in what we have shared of our story, that you will be empowered to go forward as an agent of change toward an equitable and just society.
Next slide. Before we open up to conversation, which we certainly look forward to, Paul and I would like to share with you some images of how Underground Railroad Education Center uses what it has to be an agent of change and empower others to be agents of change. You want to start? Take one or two?
Sure.
Okay.
One of the things that we did very early on in our exploration of the story of the Underground Railroad, as we learned these stories, was to create a walking tour. Now, what's interesting about walking tours is we didn't own the space. We didn't own the places that we were taking people to, but we could gather people together on a public sidewalk, move to those places and tell those stories. And so in that way, it was both an engaging and a dramatic way of sharing the story and putting other people in touch with the story.
The other thing that I found as well, not just for myself, but for others who engaged in the walking tours, was that as we proceeded from space to space and learned about the historic stories related to these spaces, everyone's concept of that sense of space changed and took on a life that they carried with them when returning to these spaces as individuals conducting business in these spaces. So it was certainly something we hadn't anticipated, but yet again helped to, contributed to a changing sense of the space in which we have been operating. The conference has been an incredible opportunity to gather people together who are interested in this topic and its contemporary relevance, and to really stretch all of us to think about different ways to both engage with the history, but then see its application within contemporary times.
I'd like to mention about the conference as well. We had been doing the walking tour for about a year. We did three or four walking tours. And as we got toward the end of the year, we said to ourselves, gosh, it would be really nice to gather with other people to really be able to explore this topic more closely, inviting some of the people who were doing things in other communities to explore the story together and see what we could learn, what new information we could learn. And also the opportunity to bring a keynote speaker into a setting to energize us and provide us with more information. And so even though we couldn't afford to do a conference, and according to some of the people that were joined with us in order to create the conference, a planning committee that we put together, we didn't have the resources. And so what we did was we set a timeline 2 weeks out, and we asked people to register for the conference 2 weeks ahead of time. That way, by the time the conference came, we had the resources for the conference. And the conference was attended by far more people than we expected, which was a great added bonus.
Mm-hmm.
The historic site, in the course of our exploring the story of the Underground Railroad, we came across a document that led us to the historic site, to the Stephen and Harriet Myers Residence Historic Site. It was a site where the Vigilance Committee of the Underground Railroad had met, where decisions were made about the Underground Railroad, and where Stephen and Harriet had lived in the mid-1850s. The building was in terrible shape. It was definitely a threatened building. I have a list about as long as my arm of things that were wrong with the building, but we took on the challenge of beginning to restore the building.
Now, I think it's only fair to say, as was referenced when we were sharing our thoughts in our keynote, we knew absolutely nothing about historic preservation. But we were so convinced that this building had a story to tell that we decided we had to jump in and save this building so that this story could be told in a very tangible way. And it has been an incredible opportunity beyond our imaginings for folks from the community to come together to reclaim this building and help bring it to life. Now, certainly, because the building's on the National Register of Historic Places, we have certain requirements to follow that do require us to engage the services of professionals. But where we could, people, folks from the community have populated the building with over 1,000 books right now in a space that we dedicated to being a library space. We have period furniture we invite visitors to sit on and engage with, and other things of that type. So it has become not just the Stephen and Harriet Myers Residence, but it really has become the community's space, where the story of not only the Myers residents, but the colleagues with whom they worked, and the contemporary connections of the justice issues that our Black abolitionists were engaging with can be told. So come visit.
Yeah, next slide.
Ooh, one too many?
Yep.
There we go. Oh, the youth programs, YALI stands, YALI stands for Young Abolitionist Leadership Institute. This is a signature program, again, a way that we have connected with the younger members of our community, our teenagers, for I think 16 years now. And it is for us a way to share with community teens this history that they're not hearing about in school, and to engage with it in a way that makes sense for them, and again, connects the history to contemporary justice issues. And just, if I can do a thumbnail sketch of how this program runs, it's not like a summer camp. We actually connect up with the Summer Youth Employment Program of the City of Albany. So the Myers residence and the surrounding Stephen and Harriet Myers residence campus, which is composed of additional properties the organization has purchased over the years. We utilize, and connecting with the Summer Youth Employment Program, the Stephen and Harriet Myers residence and campus was supposed to be a work site. that was never sufficient for me. I always felt that was really inadequate and we needed to create more. So what we have done over the years is to build a program whereby our teens do come to the campus. They are paid by the city of Albany at minimum wage for the time spent in the program, but they engage in small focus groups with professionals from the community who work with the teens both to identify a justice issue of concern to the teens, investigate the historic story related to that justice issue, then work together collaboratively to figure out a way to leave a legacy project behind that educates others about what the teens have learned. And so it's really been a very exciting program for all of us, adults as well as teens who have participated over the years.
The garden picture that you see there is a picture of what we call the Abram Johnson Garden. It's a garden that is started on a lot where Abram Johnson's house used to be. And so
And who was Abram Johnson?
in an inner city area, there are many buildings that have been torn down for various reasons, and the lots are there. So what we found that in the area around where the Stephen and Harriet Myers Historic Site exists, there were many other Underground Railroad activists who lived in that neighborhood, and their homes are now no longer there. But this particular one, a vacant lot, we were able to reclaim the vacant lot, kind of with the intervention of some teens at an early stage. And now it is a lush, thriving garden of flowers and vegetables that's open to the community. And we have volunteers that help maintain that.
Oh, before we leave the Abram Johnson Garden, I just have to tell you that the garden, well, as beautiful as it is absolutely incredible. It's not just a pretty space, but each of the raised beds in this garden, there's 19. Each of these raised beds, in each of these raised beds, you will find food and flowering plants that reflect what was growing when Stephen and Harriet Myers lived in the Stephen and Harriet Myers residence. And in addition to that, as Paul mentioned, we call this the Abram Johnson Garden because of its location on the lot where Abram Johnson's home had been located. And so on a portion of this space, the raised beds are set up to frame the footprint of the Abram Johnson house. And there is a pathway that was put in deliberately for our neighbors to have access from one point to another in the neighborhood. And this path has actually been placed at the location where the hallway was in Abram Johnson's house. So it's a pretty space with a purpose.
Yeah, so people can actually go into, so to speak, go into the house, and they can actually be in the framework of the various raised beds. And you know, there are some of the raised beds that are set up with plants that reflect restfulness.
Oh, yeah.
And some that reflect the stairway that would be in the center of the house by their graduated plant arrangement. Some that would in the front reflecting what the front parlor might have been with the formal plants in the front end. So it's very pretty. You should come and see
visit.
it. Yeah, yeah.
And then finally.
Yes, finally, we're working on creating an interpretive center. And this is, of course, the rendering of the interpretive center. It's going to be a $9.7 million project. And we certainly need help in terms of raising those funds. We're busily trying to raise those funds. We're well along the way with it. And we do hope that this summer we can break ground for this project. And in about 12 months after that, or 18 months, maybe in total, we'll be able to open it up. And it will be a space, as noted here, of a commercial kitchen, library, storage for the artifacts and things, some research space. And a feature of this building will be the reclamation of a recycled, salvaged Dutch barn frame, which will be inside the building, so that as you walk into the building, you'll be able to look up and see the timber framing that will be quite impressive and will also enable us to be able to talk about some other aspects of New York State's history, particularly that New York State at one time was a state that sanctioned slavery, And we're going to be able to reinterpret the barn frame that was once associated with slavery to talk about emancipation and freedom and abolition. So it's going to be a very magnificent space, and we do invite you to come and see it.
What I would like to add before we close is that this particular space as well, again, as with this, in terms of the way we use the Stephen and Harriet Myers residence, we expect to use this building in the same way for benefit to the community, so that it's not just about Underground Railroad Education Center and what we need. We do need space to be able to conduct programming, workshops, all sorts of creative experiences that we can only dream about with the Myers residence. Plus, having this space will allow us to clear out all the non-historic things from the Stephen and Harriet Myers residence and restore that building to its mid-1850s character. It was in a state of elegance when Stephen and Harriet Myers lived there. And we really, as a space that reflects the Black experience and Black voices, will really, we feel compelled to do it upright and to restore that space so that it speaks clearly to the contributions of people of color. And then in turn, with the Interpretive Center, we will be able to offer jobs to folks in the community. We're anticipating a lot of activity of different kinds that will require an expansion of job opportunities. And then certainly just even a reference to the commercial kitchen, that plus other aspects of what we're doing open themselves to workforce development. So lots of energy and lots of exciting things to look forward to. So there we have it. I think,
Next slide.
there we are. So this is us. We certainly would welcome you not only to visit us on the web, but come and pay us a visit in person. And
certainly pay us a visit on Facebook and Instagram and LinkedIn as well.
Yeah. So again, we thank we thank Daniel and President Scable so much for extending the invitation to us and allowing us the opportunity to be with you today. And I do hope that what we have shared has been an inspiration for you to also step out, be bold, and take hold.
And be a voice for freedom.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you
you
very
so
much.
much.
Yeah, that was terrific.
Thank you, Mary Liz. Thank you so much, Paul. I'm going to read back some of the things that I captured from your wonderful presentation that really struck me. I loved how you said that you became agents of change by trying to find answers to your questions and engage with others in research, which led you to the many pieces of the puzzle and realize that the story could not stay with you, but that it belonged to the community. And I think that one of the greatest questions I heard was, how do we share this inspiring story? And I love the quote, if they don't give you a seat at the table, bring your folding chair.
Yeah.
So you moved from curious inquiry to creating a walking tour and telling their stories. You became agents of change. Where there is a will, there is a way. Make sure to take the time to explore your past and look to the future to become an agent of change. And how do we capture other stories to become voices of freedom and agents of change? You are an inspiration. Every time I've had the opportunity to interact with you, it's been such a learning experience and such a joy and such an opportunity to explore contributions to the community. We would like to open this space for questions and comments for Mary Liz and for Paul. So please use the question and answer feature of our webinar in Zoom. And we'll take a look at those and bring them to Mary Liz and Paul.
So I have one now. Thank
Okay.
you, Mary Liz and Paul. I've had the pleasure of going to the Myers residence, and it's just impressive. And I know our folks volunteer there year after year, so that's pretty cool as well. We have a question from Jennifer Wise. She asked, how extensive was the Underground Railroad operations throughout New York State? I'm from the western part of the state. I grew up hearing some legend about the railroad operating in parts of western New York State, especially the Finger Lakes area. Just curious. Thank you.
You want to take that?
Sure, that's a great question, as most questions tend to be. Um, the one of the challenges of the Underground Railroad story is the way the story has been told historically. And when I say the way the story has been told, one of the interesting things about what was going on was that there were many people who were escaping from enslavement and making their way to freedom. They were using various modes of transportation in order to make their way. As a result of that, and as a result of some historical accidents, if you will, it started to be called the Underground Railroad. And then in retrospect, people started to impose images on the Underground Railroad. And then at some point as well, as people were traveling, they tended to use things like waterways and railroads and other roads and canals, because these were the modes of transportation of the day. Across central New York State, there was a connected route of canals and also railroads that by the time you got into the late 1850s, people were using. And so places like Elmira and Syracuse certainly were important places through which people traveled in order to make their way to freedom. And when I say make their way to freedom, when we're thinking about New York State, by and large, say in the 1840s, many people who were escaping from enslavement would find places to settle in New York State. And as you got into the 1850s, after the second federal fugitive slave law of 1850, there was a concern as to how that law would be enforced. And so many of those people who had settled in New York State moved on to Canada, and others were also looking to move on to Canada. And so they would go through a place like, through perhaps Elmira, Binghamton, go to Syracuse, cross the Finger Lakes, and then maybe up to Oswego, New York, where they would take a ferry boat from Oswego to Toronto. Or perhaps they would go in the other direction to Buffalo and into Canada there. I just want to emphasize too, that in the larger story of the Underground Railroad, people were going in all directions around the country. The Caribbean, across the Atlantic, into Mexico in the West. So wherever folks could find refuge and escape their conditions of enslavement, sometimes even hiding in the South. So
I'd like to add also in response to that question, there is an organization called Underground Railroad Consortium of New York State. This is a group of organizations. Underground Railroad Education Center is part of this group. We are a collaborative group of vetted sites and programs from around New York State. We've actually been around, let's see, I think we're pushing 9 years now, my goodness. But our effort is to continue to support the research that documents claims of Underground Railroad history related to spaces and people. And in so doing, we work together with the National Park Service Network to Freedom, which also is as an arm of the National Park Service. The Network to Freedom engages in the process of verifying or vetting historic sites and stories that people are sharing around the country. So there are some resources out there. Underground Railroad Consortium of New York State actually does have a website, and it certainly is a useful tool for identifying those places around New York State that are currently vetted and continuing to both research and continuing to tell the story as related to their specific space and New York State and the nation.
And thank you, Gretchen, for posting the link in the chat. So if you want to take a look at it, you have a link there. We have another question by Alvin Jones, Sr. Do you strictly concentrate on the Albany area or expand your search across the entire spectrum of the Underground Railroad?
Well, in terms of trying to understand the Underground Railroad story, it's hard to limit oneself to the Albany area. However, that is our initial focus and lies at the heart of what we do, telling the local story first. But we do find that in the course of doing that, we, as I was mentioning before about the Underground Railroad being an international story, not just the United States and Canada, but also Mexico, the Caribbean, Europe and Africa. It is an international story.
I would also like to offer too, when we are invited to speak publicly in places outside of Albany, we do, we try to identify local Underground Railroad connections, people, spaces, things of that sort, so that, you know, we, again, I often say we use the Albany story as a case study. But again, when we are outside of the Albany area, we like very much to identify people and spaces that have a relationship to this history for folks in the area where we are speaking.
We also have a question in the chat by Susan Wheeler, where first she says, thank you for the inspiring presentation. Do you or have you offered a book club for some of the authors you have identified? Harry Jacobs, Phyllis Whitley, and others.
Well, we do
yeah.
have, we have what we call UREC Reads. It is a book club that meets virtually the second Friday of every month.
Yeah.
When we started, we had focused especially on the narratives of people who had been enslaved. We contemporarily have moved away from that a bit because of the interest of people who have been participating. And so, for instance, our most recent book that we're working through right now is How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi. So we haven't, you know, we haven't disconnected from the history, but we're looking at the legacy of that history through some more contemporary authors. So that's how we're handling that at the moment.
Paul and Mary Liz, I have a question for you. There seems to be such an amazing opportunity for one to also join the movement in becoming voice of freedom and an agent of change. Seems to be a very important space where to enter and where to contribute. How would you recommend folks to get started or to develop further into this effort? And if you could perhaps answer the question in two different ways. With what mindset should we approach this work? Right? How should we think? How should we shift our paradigms to do this work? And two, what are practical ways in which we can actually get engaged, whether through UREC or other opportunities?
Well, one of the things that I like to think of in terms of how this story has impacted on us, and by us, I mean Mary Liz and myself, is that we are very much, I would say, driven by or framed by a scriptural passage that has been important to us, and that's from the prophet Micah in the what would be considered by Christians the Old Testament, or by Jews the Bible, straight up. And as the prophet Micah, chapter 6, verse 8, you know, O man, what is right and what the Lord your God requires of you, that you love justice, do kindness, and walk in humility. So when I think about that centerpiece, do kindness, it's really a word that's a flexible word. It means justice, it means covenant, and so that's the framework, I think, in which we begin. And then, you know, ours was a moment of historical curiosity in trying to bring a story to the communities that we were addressing, whether through a newspaper or in the students in a classroom. And just a discomfort about, you know, like, well, what is that story? And how can we figure out what that story is? And then in trying to satisfy that curiosity, you know, finding the pieces of a puzzle that began to transform our lives. And I would certainly recommend that to anyone. There are so many roads, if you will, that people can pursue in order to be pursuing justice according to things that are close to them or that they're attracted to. You know, whether it's concerned about immigrants, whether it's concerned about oppressed communities, whether it's concerned about civil rights. You know, there are many paths. So I think start with that burning desire to want to focus on justice, I think.
I would also like to add that I think it's very important that we allow ourselves to recognize the value in how we can be agents of change in our everyday lives. Helping, I'm thinking, a person working at a daycare has an opportunity to interact with young children to help them understand that, yes, while there are differences among us that we bring to any situation, there is a beauty in those differences. There is not a better and a worse, but there is a beauty that we can share together in our differences and move forward in acknowledging and recognizing the richness that we bring to a situation by virtue of those differences. We can, a simple matter of being at the grocery store and, you know, smiling at someone, acknowledging the presence of someone there. I don't know, I mean, I guess well, those seem like very small examples. They're part and parcel of our everyday lives. And it seems to me that while we as a country spend a great deal of time acknowledging the greatness of a small number of individuals, each one of us, just like Ray and Leon that I had referenced in that little story that I shared, we have our daily experiences. The fact that Ray and Leon, you know, in the language I use, remain steadfast. They were committed to living in a community that has suffered great challenges. They continue to stay there. They, you know, continue to find ways to interact in supportive manner with their neighbors. So all those small human interactions that are part of our daily lives, it seems to me, are opportunities for being agents of change. And also our being changed by the agency of others. I'm thinking about the occasions when, you know, being at the grocery store, I've got to get through that grocery store task because I have 5 other things waiting to be done. And, you know, it's really nice when someone doesn't necessarily have to talk at me, but maybe even moves their grocery cart out of the way so I can go speed down the aisle. It's a small thing, but again, it's a way of both allowing myself to be changed and then finding those daily occasions when I too can interact with others and in a way that it becomes a positively changing experience. So.
And are there any opportunities at the Underground Railroad?
By all means. Yes, we welcome volunteers. We've had some wonderful group volunteer experiences. Both actually, I think we've had some people from Excelsior, right?
Yes, we
Yeah.
did. I believe was that Juneteenth, wasn't it?
Yeah.
When we
And also from some other companies and businesses in the area, where people have done things like help organize programs or
Work in the gardens.
work in the garden, mend fences, rebuild raised beds, or even things within the building, within the setting of the kind of things that we do in the building.
I'm gonna say too, currently we have a woman, she is a retired teacher, and she is volunteering some of her time to work with me on record keeping for the current conference that we're hosting on a monthly basis, a virtual conference that's being hosted once a month. And so, you know, there are again, many opportunities. What we like to do is say, if you're interested in working with us in some fashion, you know, volunteering with us, give us a call, let's get together, talk about what you're interested in, what your skills are that you'd like to share, what needs we have, and then see how we can put these things together to make, you know, create a rich opportunity for everyone involved.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pam?
Before we end, I would like to ask the final question in the chat, but also just mention some of the comments of our audience. So Kamel says, Mary Liz and Paul Stewart are exceptional individuals and luminaries. We are so lucky to have them in our community. Thanks for being here. Susan Wheeler says, this garden is so thoughtfully constructed and planted. Gretchen says, Paul and Mary Liz, your passion for this project is contagious. Thank you so much for your work. Alvin Jones says, awesome. This is a lot of great projects on your plate to tell this incredible story. Jason says, from our community at Excelsior, says, thank you, Paul and Mary Liz, for your presentation and all you do in the community. And Jennifer says, thank you. It's extremely fascinating history with many stories within it. Jackie says, thank you both so much for all you do. And Brooke says, you both are very inspiring. Anne says, thank you so much for your work. Your work is inspiring. And our final question comes from Gretchen. And she asked, are there plans to continue with the Juneteenth celebration in 2024 at URIC?
Yes. Yes.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I'm excited because obviously we shared in that planting and implementation last Juneteenth with folks from Excelsior, and we've started at our staff level. We've sort of started a brainstorming conversation about ways that we can enliven and do some things differently this year. So yes, absolutely, and we love to have more folks come join with us and make this a great happening. So yes, absolutely.
She says, yay.
Thank you, Pam. Thank you, Mary Liz. Thank you, Paul. In closing, David, do you want to say any words or?
No, I just want to thank you, and it was terrific to visit your site in the summer, and I look forward to visiting again. And thank you. I've got to run to another meeting, but thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
And
Thank
Mary
you.
Liz and Paul, this is your home, so welcome anytime. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Linda.
you.
Thank you, Pam. Thank you,
Thank
David.
you.